The honey corpse. The ancient medicine made from human bodies, preserved in honey for 100 years. Did you know that for centuries, across the Arab world and recorded in detail by Chinese medical scholars, there existed a medicine made from the body of a person who had spent the last months of their life eating nothing but honey, then been sealed inside a stone coffin filled with honey, left untouched for 100 years, and then sold as a cure for broken bones. This was not a legend. This was a documented medical entry. It was called Mellified Man. It appeared in one of the most respected medical encyclopedias ever written, and the most disturbing part of the story is not how it was made. It is that someone had to volunteer to become it. The word mellification comes from the Latin mel, meaning honey. To mellify something is to saturate it with honey, to transform it through immersion in that sweet and ancient substance into something preserved, something altered, something that time cannot easily destroy. And mellified man is exactly what it sounds like. A human being mellified, transformed by honey from the inside out, beginning while still alive and continuing for a century after death. The primary historical source for this practice is the Bencao Gangmu, the Compendium of Materia Medica, compiled by the Chinese physician and naturalist Li Shizhen and published 1596 AD. This is not a minor document. The Bencao Gangmu is one of the greatest works of medical scholarship in Chinese history, a systematic encyclopedia of approximately 1,900 medicinal substances compiled over nearly 30 years of research. Li Shizhen drew on centuries of earlier Chinese medical literature, on his own clinical observations, and on accounts from foreign travelers and traders who brought knowledge of practices from the Arab world into the Chinese medical tradition. Within this encyclopedic and carefully documented context, Li Shizhen recorded the practice of mellified man as something he had encountered in sources describing Arab medical tradition. He did not claim to have witnessed it personally. He recorded it as a foreign practice that had been reported to Chinese scholars through the trade networks connecting China to the Middle East across the Silk Road. According to his account, the process began with a volunteer, an elderly person, typically someone near the end of a natural lifespan, who made the decision to dedicate their death, and the months leading to it, to the creation of a substance that would help people they would never meet. The decision was understood, within the framework that produced it, as the highest possible form of compassion. You were not simply dying. You were becoming medicine. To appreciate why the Mellified Man entry in the Bencao Gangmu deserves serious historical attention rather than dismissal as folklore, you need to understand what kind of document the Compendium of Materia Medica actually is, and what kind of scholar Li Shizhen actually was. Li Shizhen was born in 1518 in Hubei Province, China, into a family of physicians. He trained in medicine from childhood and spent his career as both a practicing doctor and an obsessive researcher. The Bencao Gangmu, which he completed in 1578 and spent the last years of his life trying to have published. It appeared in print only after his death, represents nearly 3 decades of systematic effort to catalogue, verify, and organize everything known about medicinal substances in the Chinese tradition and beyond. The work runs to approximately 1.9 million Chinese characters across 52 volumes. It covers minerals, plants, animals, and substances derived from human bodies. It distinguishes carefully between what Li Shizhen had confirmed through his own observation or reliable clinical reports and what he was recording as tradition or foreign account. He was not credulous. He explicitly criticized earlier medical texts for including inaccurate information and identified specific errors in his predecessor's work. When Li Shizhen recorded the Mellified Man, he placed it in a section of the compendium dealing with substances derived from the human body, a category that included various other human-derived medical preparations that were documented features of both Chinese and Arab medical practice of the period. The entry was not presented as myth or speculation. It was presented as a medical account from a foreign tradition, recorded with the same systematic approach he applied to everything else in the work. The sourcing of the entry to Arab medical tradition is historically coherent. The medieval Arab medical tradition was one of the most sophisticated in the world during the period when this practice is described, and Arab medical texts were reaching China through the Silk Road trade networks that connected the two civilizations across Central Asia. The specific practice described, using honey as a medium for human body preservation, fits within a broader Arab understanding of honey's preservative properties that was medically sophisticated and practically grounded. The process of creating a mellified man began, according to Li Shizhen's account, with an act of deliberate choice. An elderly person, the sources suggest someone who had already lived a full life and was approaching its natural end, made the decision to dedicate their remaining time and their body after death to the production of medicine. This was understood not as suicide or self-harm, but as the ultimate expression of a specific ethical principle: the willingness to subordinate one's own comfort and ultimately one's own physical existence to the benefit of people who would need healing in the future. The philosophical framework that made this comprehensible within the Arab tradition that Li Shizhen was describing drew on a deep Islamic principle of charitable giving. The concept that the highest form of generosity is that which costs the giver the most. Most charitable acts cost money, time, or effort. The Mellified Man volunteer was giving something that could not be given back and could not be replaced. Within this framework, the act was not disturbing. It was sublime. Once the decision was made, the volunteer began a radically restricted diet. According to the historical account, they stopped eating all ordinary food and began consuming only honey. Not honey mixed with other things. Not honey as a supplement to a normal diet. Honey alone, as the exclusive source of nutrition, consumed in whatever quantities the body could process. Water was also eliminated or reduced to minimal amounts. The only liquid intake was honey. The physiological effects of this diet, sustained over weeks and months, would have been profound. The human body requires protein, fat, complex carbohydrates, vitamins, and minerals that honey alone cannot provide in adequate quantities. A person subsisting exclusively on honey would experience progressive nutritional deficiency, declining organ function, and a gradual physical deterioration that the ancient sources describe with what we must acknowledge is a certain detached clinical tone as the body being prepared, its ordinary biological content being replaced over time with the sweet substance that was being continuously consumed. What actually happens to a human body that consumes nothing but honey for an extended period is a question that sits at the intersection of ancient belief and modern biochemistry. The ancient account describes a physical transformation that is partly metaphorical and partly grounded in observable biological reality. Honey is approximately 80% sugars, primarily fructose and glucose, with the remaining 20% consisting of water, enzymes, minerals, vitamins, and various organic compounds. It has no protein and negligible fat. A person consuming only honey is receiving an adequate caloric intake from simple sugars, but is completely lacking in the amino acids, essential fatty acids, and micronutrients that the body requires to maintain its tissues and organ systems. Over weeks of this diet, the body would begin breaking down its own muscle tissue to supply the amino acids that the diet was not providing. Fat reserves would be depleted. The digestive system, receiving only easily absorbed simple sugars, would progressively reduce its activity, which is consistent with the ancient description of the body eliminating its ordinary waste products and becoming internally cleaner. The skin, exposed to the honey compounds being metabolized and excreted, might develop an altered smell, which the ancient sources describe as the body beginning to smell of honey even while still alive. The ancient account also describes the volunteer bathing in honey as part of the preparation process. This external application, combined with the internal transformation from the dietary honey, was understood to be saturating the body from both directions, preparing it for the preservation that would continue after death. From a purely chemical standpoint, the sugar compounds from honey do penetrate the skin and interact with surface tissues, and the antimicrobial compounds in honey would have affected the skin microbiome in ways that would alter the body's surface chemistry even before death occurred. The volunteer died, according to the historical account, in a state of profound physical weakness, but the sources emphasize this: mental clarity. The death was natural, the product of the dietary restriction rather than any violent act. And at the moment of death, the second phase of the process began. The body of the Mellified Man volunteer was placed in a stone sarcophagus. This was not a simple container. According to the description in the historical sources, it was a vessel designed for a specific long-term chemical process, large enough to contain the body with room for the preserving medium, sealed tightly enough to prevent air circulation, and durable enough to remain intact for a century without maintenance or supervision. The body was placed inside, and honey was poured in until the body was completely submerged. Then the sarcophagus was sealed. The date of sealing was inscribed on the exterior, and then nothing happened. For 100 years, the chemistry that occurred inside that sealed stone container during those 100 years is the most scientifically interesting part of the entire Mellified Man account. Honey is, in purely chemical terms, one of the most effective natural preservation media known to exist. Its preservative properties derive from several overlapping mechanisms that modern food science has analyzed in detail. First, honey has an extremely low water content, typically less than 20% by weight. This creates what chemists call a low water activity environment, meaning that the water molecules present are tightly bound to sugar compounds and are not freely available to support microbial growth. Bacteria and fungi require free water to metabolize and reproduce. In honey, that free water is essentially absent. Second, honey is acidic, with a pH typically between 3.2 and 4.5. Most pathogenic bacteria cannot grow at this acidity level. Third, honey contains hydrogen peroxide, produced by the enzyme glucose oxidase that bees introduce during honey production. Hydrogen peroxide is a well-established antimicrobial compound. Fourth, honey contains various phenolic compounds, flavonoids, and other organic molecules with documented antimicrobial properties. A body sealed in honey in an airtight container would not decompose in the ordinary sense. The process that would occur over decades and centuries would be a slow, progressive chemical transformation, the body's tissues gradually dehydrating through osmosis as the honey drew moisture from the cells. The proteins slowly altering their structure in the sugar-rich environment, the whole becoming over time something that was no longer simply a preserved body, but a genuinely transformed material. The scientific basis for honey's preservative properties is well established by modern research and confirms that the ancient understanding of honey as a substance capable of preventing decay was not simply magical thinking. It was empirical observation, accumulated over millennia of watching honey resist the biological processes that destroy most organic matter. The oldest confirmed honey ever found was discovered on archaeological excavations in Georgia, the country in the Caucasus region, and is estimated to be approximately 5,000 years old. It was still chemically recognizable as honey. Ancient Egyptian tombs have yielded honey that was still edible after 3,000 years of sealed storage. These are not anomalies. They reflect the genuine and remarkable chemical stability of honey under the right storage conditions. The application of these properties to human tissue preservation was understood in the ancient world in practical rather than theoretical terms. Egyptian embalming practice used natron, a naturally occurring salt compound, as its primary preservative medium, but honey was also used in certain Egyptian funerary preparations, and the preservative properties of both substances were empirically understood, even if the chemistry behind them was not. In the specific context of the Mellified Man, the honey-immersed body, sealed in an airtight stone container for a century, would undergo a process that modern biopreservation research can partly model. The dehydrating effect of the honey would progressively remove the free water from the body's tissues through osmotic pressure. The same process that causes food to become desiccated when packed in salt or sugar. As the water content of the tissues decreased, the conditions for bacterial decomposition would become progressively less hospitable. The body that emerged from a century in honey, if the historical account is accurate in its description, would be described in the sources as having taken on a golden amber color, having become firm and resistant to decay, and having a distinctive smell that the ancient texts describe as sweet rather than putrid. Whether any physical example of this actually exists anywhere in the archaeological record is a question that remains genuinely open. No confirmed Mellified Man specimen has been identified by modern archaeology. But the chemistry described is not impossible. It is, in fact, consistent with what modern science understands about honey's interaction with biological tissue. The Mellified Man was not preserved as a curiosity or as a religious relic. It was preserved as medicine. And according to Li Shijian's account, it was medicine of a very specific and highly valued kind, reserved for injuries that ordinary treatments could not address. The primary application described in the historical sources was the treatment of traumatic injuries, broken bones, severe wounds, injuries that had failed to heal through conventional means. The preparation method involved carefully breaking off pieces of the preserved material. The ancient descriptions suggest that after a century in honey, the body had become something with a consistency that permitted this, and grinding them into a powder. This powder was then dissolved in liquid, typically water or a medicinal wine, and administered to the patient. The theoretical framework that justified this treatment connected to a principle found across many ancient medical traditions, that substances with powerful properties transfer those properties to whatever they come into contact with. A person who had spent their final months transforming their body through honey immersion, and who had then been preserved in honey for a century, was understood to carry within their transformed tissue the concentrated healing properties of honey, amplified and focused through the extraordinary preparation process. Modern pharmacology would find no active compounds in such a preparation that would have meaningful clinical effects on bone healing or wound repair beyond those of ordinary honey itself. The mechanisms by which bone fractures heal involve cellular processes: osteoblast activation, collagen synthesis, mineral deposition, that are not accelerated by any substance that could be derived from a honey-preserved human body. Whatever clinical benefit patients believed they received was almost certainly attributable to the placebo effect. The genuine and measurable physiological improvement that occurs when patients believe they are receiving effective treatment, combined with whatever honey compounds survived in the preparation. But within the medical framework of the time, the treatment made complete theoretical sense, and it was expensive enough. The sources indicate that genuine Mellified Man preparations were extraordinarily rare and costly, that the placebo response generated by receiving a treatment of such obvious value and scarcity would have been correspondingly powerful. The ethical dimension of the Mellified Man is the aspect that most sharply separates the ancient framework from modern sensibility, because modern ethics, both secular and religious, treats the human body as something that deserves respect after death, something that should not be consumed, commodified, or used as a raw material, regardless of the purpose. But this modern consensus is itself historically specific. It reflects particular developments in Western ethical thinking about bodily integrity and human dignity that are relatively recent by the scale of recorded history. The ancient world and the medieval Arab world that Li Shizhen was drawing on operated within different ethical frameworks that generated different conclusions about the relationship between the living person, the dead body, and the needs of others. Within the Islamic tradition, the body is generally considered a trust, something that belongs ultimately to God rather than to the individual, and that should be treated with dignity. This framework would normally prohibit practices that desecrated or consumed human remains. And yet the Mellified Man tradition is described as coming from within a broadly Arab and Islamic cultural context. The resolution of this apparent tension in the historical sources lies in the concept of the volunteer. The person who freely chose this fate without coercion, in full understanding of what would happen to their body. A freely chosen sacrifice, made for the benefit of others, occupies a different ethical category than the involuntary use of a person's remains. The Volunteers Act was understood as a form of sadaqah, charitable giving of the highest order, that transformed the ethical status of what happened to the body afterward. The body had been donated, consciously and willingly, to a purpose beyond the donor's life. The comparison to practices in other traditions is instructive. The use of human remains in medieval European medicine, including the consumption of blood, fat, and bone from executed criminals, documented in European pharmacopoeias well into the 17th century, operated without the element of voluntary sacrifice. It was simply the use of conveniently available human material. The Mellified Man tradition, whatever its historical reality, was built on a fundamentally different ethical premise. The Mellified Man does not exist in historical isolation. It belongs to a broader tradition of human-derived medicine that was surprisingly widespread across multiple civilizations and time periods. A tradition that modern sensibility has largely forgotten, but that was documented, practiced, and commercially significant in many parts of the ancient and early modern world. In medieval and early modern Europe, the use of human-derived substances in medicine was extensive and openly documented in pharmacological literature. Mummy Brown, a pigment used by European painters from the 16th through 19th centuries, was made from ground Egyptian mummies imported specifically for this purpose. European apothecaries stocked powdered mummy as a medicinal preparation recommended for various ailments. The fat of executed criminals was used in wound salves. Blood from the recently dead was considered to have medicinal properties and was harvested and sold in some European contexts. These European practices, which most modern people would find as disturbing as the Mellified Man, were not considered unusual or ethically problematic by the people who used them. They operated within a medical framework that understood the transfer of vital properties from the dead to the living as a legitimate therapeutic mechanism. A framework that is intellectually continuous with, even culturally distinct from, the Arab and Chinese traditions that produced the Mellified Man account. The comparison to Egyptian mummification is also instructive. The Egyptian mummification process was not designed to create medicine. It was designed to preserve the body for the afterlife, within a religious framework entirely different from the medical purpose of Mellified Man. But both practices drew on the same empirical understanding of honey and natron as preservation media, and both reflected a sophisticated practical knowledge of how to prevent biological decay in human tissue. The Mellified Man represents the application of preservation knowledge in a specifically medical direction, with the addition of the voluntary sacrifice element that is unique to this tradition. Whether any physical specimen of a Mellified Man has ever been found is a question that archaeology cannot currently answer. No confirmed example has been identified in any museum or private collection. Given the destructive nature of the consumption process, the preserved material was ground and dissolved. The survival of an intact specimen would be unlikely, even if the practice were real and documented. The evidence for Mellified Man remains textual rather than physical. The historical account of Mellified Man raises questions that go beyond the specific practice itself. Questions about the human relationship with death, with medicine, with the body, and with the lengths people will go to in pursuit of healing for themselves or for others. The practice, as described by Li Shizhen, drawing on Arab sources, apparently ceased, or became extremely rare by the 16th century, the period when the Bentao Gangmu was being compiled. Whether this cessation reflected a genuine fading of the practice or simply a loss of documentation is unclear. Li Shizhen records it in the past tense, as something that had existed rather than something that was currently occurring. By the time European travelers were moving through the Arab world in significant numbers, in the 17th and 18th centuries, there are no accounts of Mellified Man production that have been identified in their records. The most intellectually honest assessment of the Mellified Man tradition is that it exists in the uncertain space between historical record and elaborated account. Li Shizhen was a careful scholar, but he was recording something from a foreign tradition filtered through multiple layers of transmission. The core elements: honey as a preservation medium, voluntary sacrifice for medicinal purposes, the use of preserved human material in treating severe injuries, are all individually plausible and connected to real practices. Whether they were ever combined in exactly the way described is something that the available evidence cannot definitively confirm or deny. What the account reveals with certainty is the depth of the human search for healing in periods before modern medicine existed. People with broken bones that would not heal, with injuries that modern surgery could repair in an hour, had no reliable options. In that context of genuine desperation, the willingness to try something as extraordinary as Mellified Man, or to volunteer to become it, was not madness. It was the logical endpoint of a belief system that valued life and sought healing through every means available, including means that the next generation would find incomprehensible. Every era has its medical practices that the next generation finds disturbing. Ours will be no different. The Mellified Man asks us to hold that awareness before judging the people who believed in it.